Literacy program sponsored by the Gannon Center and the Chicago Network for Justice and Peace. One of the essential issues that we as citizens and responsible citizens need to address is how we can encourage the development of an informed citizenry. A citizenry that has an opportunity to see what are the real issues facing us as a people in the state of Illinois, the city of Chicago, and as members of the United States of America. Today's program is an opportunity for us to hear from some of the experts in the Chicagoland area on how the fiscal irresponsibility in the state of Illinois will color the election of 2014. My name is Janet Sisler. I'm the director of the Gannon Center for Women in Leadership, and with Nick Petrika, who is the head of the Chicago Network for Justice and Peace, we wish to welcome you this afternoon. I'd like to have you feel free to walk back and graze as the conversation goes on, and also to let you know that there are women's and men's bathrooms immediately on the right and the left outside of these doors. So if anyone has any other questions in regard to hospitality, please feel free to ask them of me. I'll be around. But now I would like to introduce Nick Petrika, a member of the E-Caucus, as well as the president of the Chicago Network for Justice and Peace. Nick?
Thank you, Jen, and thank you all of the people here for attending. I am grateful to you for coming out here on a very busy Thursday, and especially for this topic, which I think is important, but I must say many of my friends said, is it money? We don't understand money. We don't like to talk about money. We don't understand how the government uses money. We don't understand how it's raised, and we don't understand how they account for it. We don't even understand who decides. Well, they should come here and listen. And I'm very grateful to Jan, as always, for our hospitality and for hosting this event, which the Chicago Network does before every election. And I'm very grateful to each of the panelists for their time and for their smarts. They're very qualified to help us to understand the complexities of this issue, or of all of these issues. And I want to thank Tracy Baim of Windy City Times for moderating and for giving us such excellent PR on this program. I want to say just one thing as a future advertisement. On the 13th of November, we will have an all-day teach-in on the child migrant, children crossing borders. We will have a really dynamite panels throughout the day, and we will also have theater events throughout the day and a more formal theater presentation in the evening. So keep alert to that on the 13th of November. Thank you again for coming, and Tracy.
Thanks everybody for being here. I'm going to introduce our panel, and then we're going to just briefly have them present a little bit about what they hope to accomplish today, and then we'll go into questions. We have Dennis Conroy here. He has 3 decades of nonprofit development and communications experience. As Metropolitan Family Services Senior Vice President of External Affairs, he oversees all fundraising and campaign activities. Katie Drews on the end is an investigative reporter with the Better Government Association. Greg Hinz, a columnist on politics for Crain Chicago Business, is a graduate of Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. And closest to me here is Dr. Twyla Blackmond Larnell, an assistant professor of political science at Loyola University. So Twyla, why don't we start with you and talk about what in the financial sector related to government interests you most and to talk about today.
So from my perspective, I guess I'm interested in all the areas of Illinois' fiscal problems. I've been focusing mostly...
Is your microphone on?
My microphone is not working. Oh, it's not. Is that better?
Yes.
So in terms of my research, and even the things I focus on mostly in the class, I talk a lot about Illinois' finances as it relates heavily to education and economic development, particularly in urban areas. Right now, the biggest interest to me is, again, it's everything, because I just feel like we can't address any of the major problems facing Illinois, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's healthcare spending, whether it's education, whether it's the prison system. All of them require us to revisit how Illinois does business in terms of its finances. And so I'm kind of all over.
Greg?
Hey, I want to congratulate you for holding a forum to actually talk about the issues. I thought this campaign was all about how Bruce Rauner, a rapacious businessman who slaps around women and likes old ladies to fall over and die in nursing homes and ratchets up prices on drugs for dying babies, is going to do the same to the budget, and how Pat Quinn is a common boo who hasn't got a thing done. This election really ought to be about money, and ought to be, because the professor is right. The state has all kinds of financial problems, and those problems are deeply exacerbated by the fact that our economy has not been growing very fast. It's finally started to pick up in the last 6 months. There may be some structural reasons on that have absolutely nothing to do with politics, or perhaps they do. But if you don't have revenues and you have rising expenses, you have a real problem. The key, there's two big drivers in the state budget. One is Medicaid. That's now largely tied to national health care, aka Obamacare. We made the decision to join it. So that die is pretty well cast. Some conservatives like to say there's all kinds of waste there, and if we get rid of the fraud and shake down everybody, we'll get rid of a big chunk of the cost. You get rid of some of it, I'm not convinced there's huge costs to be made to be gotten there. On the fraud side, it's just a question of providing the service, something we go without, which is a question that has a moral aspect to it. The other big driver are pension costs for retired state workers and those who are going to retire, and I can't tell you how bad of a problem that is. All the numbers are going in the wrong way because the number of people paying into the system relative to the number of people retiring is dropping. It's a bad ratio. The state never put in the kind of money that it should have. The unions are right about that. The employer's share was always cut by account. When it came time to appropriate in Springfield, it was more fun to spend it to build a road or set up a program or give a tax cut rather than put it in pensions. And now the bill is kind of come due because the society in Illinois is older. So we have in the state's 4 major pension funds a stunning $100 billion in unfunded liability. What we have to pay as opposed to what we have set aside to pay it. And that's a conservative figure by some accounts because we're assuming we're going to get a lot, we're going to get a 7.5% to 8% on rates of return on what we've invested over the years, and that may not prove to be the case. So the legislature last year finally took the first step. And changing that, it passed a law to reform 2 of the 4 pension plans, mostly by dramatically reducing cost of living increases for people once they retire, and pairing that with more money that we were going to put in taxes. That plan is now being challenged before the state Supreme Court. The justices have given a couple of hints that they're going to throw it out. I'll explain why if you want me to go into the details. But the essential argument they're making is we in effect had a contract when we took our jobs and we're breaching our contract by reducing our benefits. Even if the plan is upheld, we have to come up with the money to pay for it in the future. And we've only dealt with 2 of the 4 problems. The same is true of the city of Chicago, by the way. The mayor, with the union, did reach a solution on 2 of the 4 pension plans last year. That's going to cost taxpayers an incremental $50 million additional each year. $50 million this year, $100 million next year, $150 million the year after that. But he still hasn't gotten an agreement on the police and fire funds. If we don't reach an agreement on that in the next year under current law, taxpayers in the city of Chicago will have to come up with an additional $600 million. The only place to really get that is property taxes. So I don't know if any of you own property, but Aldermen scream about 20 or $30 million increases in their property tax. 600 million is through the roof. Anyhow, all that is the context for this debate over whether we ought to extend in whole or in part the temporary income tax that was passed under Pat Quinn a little while ago. Most fiscal experts I trust tell me that it would probably be almost impossible for the state to do without all that money. We merely did what we did before, which is let our IOUs run up, and they had reached a really high level. But at the same time, I think you can make an argument that Pat Quinn shouldn't have asked for all of it, as he has. He wants it all to come up. It's going to come up at the General Assembly's veto session this fall, almost certainly. Bruce Rauner, on the other hand, keeps arguing that, hey, I'm going to get rid of this tax. We don't need it. I'm going to do some other stuff. But he's been extremely vague on what the other stuff is. And he's been more than vague on what he's going to cut to make up for the loss of revenue, which is why Quinn keeps saying that he's going to devastate the hell out of education. Anyhow, simple math, the numbers don't add up. I'll give you more details on all this later, but it's more fun for everybody to talk about the personalities of the evil opponent, but underlying it all really is fun.
Okay, Dennis, you want to go next?
Sure. This thing is low. Actually, what I'm doing here today is reaching out to you, and I'm reaching out to you and I'm bribing you with candy on your chairs. There's a, you can walk around and find the one you like, because we didn't know how to match up the seat with the candy. But the reason the candy's on your chair is there's a URL on there to find your legislator. And the challenge I offered you today is to make noise, what they say in political campaigns and politics in general. In addition, I deferred to true experts on this panel that are going to talk about financing and structural deficits and the way out of this mess. But I would submit to you that there's choices also, and there's ethics involved in choices. I happen to represent right now a human services agency. It's Metropolitan Family Services, and it's one of approximately 4,000 organizations in this state that are devoted to taking care of all of our family members, children, elderly, programs like domestic violence programs, after-school programs, without naming all of them. I think I have an audience here that could follow really fast what human services is about. But what isn't often done is there's a shyness or an unwillingness or a really question mark on the part of you as to whether or not your voice should be heard, and if so, if you're going to make noise, what is it you say? And that's the challenge I throw out today, is to realize that the legislators actually do want to hear from you. It may not be for the reason you think, but they need cover and they need to hear from their constituents on why the constituents want them to vote in certain ways. And if we don't do it, then the talking heads, however you want to call it, the pundits, those who are very articulate for a way of living, take over the dialogue instead of us. So it's a citizens, it's not a call to action, a call to arms, whatever it is that motivates you. That's what I hope is part of the takeaway today, and we can get a little involved in that. And I wanted to end on just a couple of statistics that are frame of reference for me. Is there's over 500,000 folks employed in this state in not-for-profits beyond human services, and depending on where the budgeting goes, their livelihood and their ability to take care of the people who come to them for help, they are going to be terribly affected by choices in government. And here's my closer. It's already happened. The other shoe dropped. Back in 2009, when I joined Metropolitan Family Services, on my first day on the job, I didn't read into this, by the way, but the state sent out a notice to all human service providers that their budget had been cut by 50%. It wasn't going to happen. It happened. And for an agency that had a little over 500 employees, 100 of the employees were given layoff notices. So about 20% of the workforce was put on notice. And that was reversed when the American Civil Liberties Union went to court on behalf of the Department of Children and Family Services, and all these children programs were reinstated. So you had about 80 employees, now paranoid, were reinstated, and it staved off what is coming around the bend again. So it's not like, watch out, it could happen. It did happen. And we lived through it and we went on, but there's been a lot of shrinkage in the sector, as it's called, ever since that time. And so there's your voice, your neighbors, your families. I think we've got a lot of skin in the game and a need to be heard as the decisions are made down in Springfield and elsewhere about how we deal with the money issues. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. So I work for the Better Government Association. I'm not sure if you all are familiar with it, but essentially what we do, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan news outlet based here in Chicago. And we do a lot of investigative journalism covering all sorts of government-related issues. So a lot of the problems that we encounter relate to government corruption, waste, and inefficiencies. What we advocate for and what we would like to see is government accountability and transparency. Unfortunately, a lot of times what we are seeing is government agencies that are not held accountable and oftentimes just blatant disregard for transparency. So that's what we're about.
Okay, since Greg talked in detail about the pension issues, I'd like to maybe go back to that first and talk about who is putting solutions on the table and what people at the table really think about what options there are really facing on specifically the pension crisis.
Well, the first word, and maybe the last word, is going to go to the Illinois Supreme Court. They're going to tell us sometime in the next 6 months, I would guess, how much we can reduce benefits beyond what they are now. The union position is that if there's a different set of rules for people who were hired after January 1st of 2011, but if you were hired on December 31st of 2010, the union's position is that you shall continue to accrue for the rest of your working life, be it 45 or 50 years, benefits at the same level as you were before then, and that nothing can ever change. Regardless of what happens in the society, that's a binding contract, and it maintains. And there's some language in the state constitution that appears to suggest that that's the case. Other people say that's ridiculous. Of course, there's got to be some room there to move around. So the Supremes could go at one extreme or the other, or they could do something in between. For instance, there's a school of thought out there that says that you can reduce benefits for people that are still working, but not people who've already retired. There's another school of thought that says you can reduce benefits if you've negotiated with the labor union that represents people, since there's some genuine give and take, and if the union agrees to give this for that, then you can do it. There's a third school of thought, this is the one that Mr. Raumer pushes, that says that you get to keep everything you've earned up to today, but from now on, the rules are entirely different. Which of those positions that the court takes has staggering financial implications? I mean, none of us does good with big numbers, but there's tens of billions of dollars of differences in each of those, because you're talking about so many people over so much time. Mr. Quinn's position, since you have to decide between these two guys, is that we're on the right course. I've made some tough decisions here. I got a bill through, and I think the Supreme Court's going to uphold it. If it's not, we'll go back. We'll find something else. That's a little vague. Mr. Rauner's position is that, as I said, we're going to give people just what they've earned today, and from today on, we're going to put everybody into a 401k system, in which the state's contribution will be limited, which that shifts the risk from the group onto the individual, because if there's not enough pension anymore, the state doesn't have to raise its amount. The person's got to somehow figure it out. And fiscally, it leaves an even bigger problem, because under Mr. Rauner's proposal, the revenue stream that now goes into the pot from current people to pay for the retirees would be diverted into these new 401ks. That leaves you a transition cost of about $100 billion, and he hasn't said yet how we're going to pay that. So both guys have flaws in their plan. How bad it is, we won't know until we know what the Supreme Court says.
Anybody else want to speak on the pension issues?
To follow Mr. Hinz, right, this pension issue is, it's a really big deal. $100 billion is a lot of money. It's a lot of money, and neither candidate has identified where they're going to get this money from and how soon they're going to pay it. The biggest issue is that these unfunded obligations, along with the healthcare obligations that are also being increased at this time because we have moved to affordable healthcare, right? The number of people who are going to be taking advantage of Illinois' public healthcare system has increased by a lot as well. So we're seeing these pension obligations that are coming to the table, and we're also seeing the obligations to healthcare and human services that are increasing at the same time as well. And there's nowhere to get the money because Illinois' economy is one of the slowest growing economies since the recession. You don't want to have to go through this transitional period, as Mr. Hinz has pointed out, because again, it's $100 billion that the revenue stream that was once there will no longer be there, because the 401k would start immediately, which means that the money that they were diverting to pay for the pensions for those who have retired now is going to go to pay their own pensions. In terms of moving the risk from the group, which is the state, to the individual, a lot of individual state employees are okay with this 401k plan because it gives them a little bit more power in how that money is invested. Technically, they own this money as soon as they start to invest it, et cetera, et cetera. With the pension program, though, it is guaranteed. And so you have many employees that really want the state to figure this out, but there just isn't any money to figure it out because they have not been paying their bill for a really long time. This is not something that just happened overnight. It's not like you look up and, oops, I lost $100 billion. This has been happening for a really long time. At the same time, though, to find a new stream of revenue to cover a $100 billion debt is very hard because we just increased income taxes. Right now, you have a lot of individuals at the Capitol that are arguing that while some are arguing to further increase taxes to cover the bill for pensions, many people are arguing that by increasing the corporate tax in particular from, what was it, 7.5% to 9.3%, that Illinois has shot itself in the foot. So as we start to approach January 1st, where these temporary tax rates are going to be pushed back to their 2011 levels, that's going to be a massive decrease in the amount of income tax revenue that the state is going to have. And so now we're in an even bigger hole. So it's not just, how do we pay for pensions, but we also have to consider whether or not we, one, stick with the increases to taxes that we've already had in the last 10 years or 2 years, and if we increase them even more. But if we increase taxes even more, there's nobody at the state capitol that's really willing to increase the corporate taxes. And corporate taxes are not even anywhere near the biggest stream of revenue in the state of Illinois, by the way. They're scared to increase corporate taxes. They're scared to decrease tax expenditures. Tax expenditures are any exemptions, deductions, or credits. That's money that people should be paying in the form of taxes, but they get to not pay it because of credits, deductions, etc. But there's like $500 million in tax expenditures for the state of Illinois for 2014. That's $500 million that should have been paid in taxes, that was not paid in taxes because of a wide variety of various exemptions, deductions, and credits. And many of those went to big businesses, right? So is there money to cover this bill? Of course. But where this money is, nobody really seems to want to tap into it.
Let me just, if your eyeballs aren't already glazed over, let me add one other example of just how friggin' complicated this whole thing is and why the political calculus you need to get it out requires a supercomputer. I said before, the state of Illinois has 4 pension funds. Those are the guys that are $100 billion short. But the biggest of those funds doesn't cover state employees. It doesn't even cover state university employees. It covers local school districts, every school district in the state of Illinois, except the city of Chicago. Now, ironically, in the city of Chicago, most people tend to favor a tax increase, but we in Chicago, we pay for the retirement costs of our teachers ourselves. All the employer's share comes from Chicago taxpayers. For the rest of the state, the employer's share, for the most part, comes from the state of Illinois. So one of the ideas that was run up the flagpole when we were debating this bill last year was, and this came from Mike Madigan, the Speaker of the House, was, well, let's ship this bill back to the local school districts. They're the one that agreed to the contracts with the teachers to give them these pensions. Why shouldn't they pay it? Well, big surprise, the suburban lawmakers went crazy. What? You're telling me I'm going to have to raise property taxes in my town 10 or 15 or 20%? Are you crazy? Find it somewhere else. Yeah, but where's somewhere else? Even worse, because the local school districts don't pay the employer share themselves, the state does, they do things that effectively game the system. It's a not unfrequent practice in a lot of suburban school districts to give good old Charlie, the chairman of the high school Department of Economics, a 20% raise his last 2 years. Won't cost the school district much, but it will permanently jack up his pension because the pension is based on what you've only earned in the last couple or 3 years. So if somebody really had, there's a solution there to be found somewhere in the middle if somebody had some political guts working it out. It's real tough.
Just to expand on what Greg said a little bit, now the $100 billion, that's for the major funds, major state funds. We also took a look at some of the smaller police and fire funds in suburban Cook County. So just to show you the extent of the problem, added all of that together for these suburban funds. Even that alone was more than $3 billion in unfunded liability. So again, these are problems facing local municipalities who may have to cut services or raise property taxes. And just to give you one example, the city of Harvey, they were required it was a 4-year period between 2010 to 2013, and they were required to contribute $10 million to their pension fund, and they only contributed about $100. So it just goes to show the extent of the problems here.
I'm going to play off that last comment. Anybody in here a fan of the Coen brothers? Well, there's a movie called Old Brother Where Art Thou, and one of the characters talks about rascalism. And one of the things that's happened in Illinois, I don't think we have anything over in any state in the union, is rascalism, where people have been reaching in the till and they've been getting away with it. There's also been what our true experts, the finance experts haven't used the word, but creative accounting. Where you have our pensions and we can borrow against those pensions. It happens federal level, it happens in the state level. And I'm going back to the point I made when I made my opening comment, which is one of the outcomes hopefully today. And one of the outcomes is if you try to keep up with experts, like the professor and the well-known journalist and the subspecialty experts in rooting out corruption, you won't win. You can't do it, and we know the bar is high. But one thing you can do as a citizen is say, common sense is going to rule here. I have a checkbook, and I know if I don't balance it, I'm screwed. And I want my government to do the same thing. You can say that to legislators when you call them. And those of you who serve on church, synagogue, mosque, you may be with a faith-based organization. You may serve on boards. You can find your allies to agree that in order to do your mission, that you have to join in the noise to legislators to clean up their act and call them out for the rascalism, because it's right there, it's on the front page, without naming the governors who've been in jail or still in jail. We have quite a reputation. There seems to be a marriage in this state between financial irregularity and corruption. And that kind of cleaning house is one of the things that not-for-profits urge their boards to do, and I urge you to also use that as a starting point, which is I'm not an expert, but I do have a tax-paying role in this state. It's my money we're talking about here, and how can we partner with you to make this case? And so one of the offers I was going to make today is for those of us, there's 2 or 3 in this room that are from the not-for-profit sector, who work with boards and who do trainings, etc., is there's a debate as to whether or not you belong at the table to have these debates along with experts, and I'd strongly, strongly urge you to find yourself in there and to learn from today's discussion on what those key talking points would be.
I just have to add one quick PS to that. I agree with everything you said about rascalism. There was a budget hearing today in City Hall, Mayor Emanuel's proposed new budget, and somebody tweeted a picture out of it of a cockroach walking up the wall of the city council chamber. And you ought to see, you should read the tweets about the alderman from the 51st Ward, and how do you get out of his chair and whatever. There's eminent truth to that, but one of the rascals is the one you look at in the mirror in the morning, because the politicians try to do generally what they think we want them to do. When Emmanuel rolled out this solution a few months ago to half of the city's pension problem, and he said it was going to cost $50 million a year in additional income tax or additional property taxes each of the next 5 years. The city council went ballistic. The Twitter sphere went ballistic. All kinds of people were protesting. How dare you raise our property tax? You can't do that. We can't afford that amount of fixed income or whatever. So what he ended up doing is they floated a bill in Springfield to raise cell phone taxes instead. Coincidentally, about $50 million a year. So the first year is out of the pocket. But getting out of this mess is going to require all of us digging in a little bit deeper than we do now. And if the politicians sense they're going to want to do it, they're going to be tempted to be rascals.
And for my post I see so many of my students in here, I feel like I have to make it very clear the impact that this pension problem is, right? On the one hand, if the state doesn't pay its bills, we're going to have a lot of retirees that are going to be very hungry, etc. But at the same time, the state is going to have to pay this bill. They have to. And if they don't increase taxes, they're going to take this money from somewhere else. And right now, there's no other place to take it. Schools across the state are in desperate need of more resources, especially in the downstate and in the lovely global city in which we are looking out on the lake right now. But right, we have to address education. We have to address this massive issue with infrastructure. The state of Illinois has has the most interstate mileage, right? It has the most used railroads. The 6 largest railroads have a hub here in the state of Illinois, but our infrastructure, it's not a cockroach, but it's scared. Right, but the state of Illinois is a hub for transportation and infrastructure, but our infrastructure is deteriorating right before our eyes. It's not just what we see in the city of Chicago. It's spread throughout the entire state, and they're scared to spend money to fix these roads because they don't have the money to do it and everything else. There's just a ton of policy problems that are coming to a head right now, and they are all very urgent, and they all require a lot of money, and now we get hit with this $100 million debt as well. And our credit rating is declining, so the state can't even get money from anywhere else. They can't borrow in the way that they were borrowing before. In other words, we found ourselves in a pretty tight spot.
So Dennis mentioned the temporary income tax issue. The likelihood is that, I mean, if Quinn gets elected, he's going to try to push it through. And if he doesn't get elected, probably still try to do it in the veto session. So what happens if the temporary income tax does not get through?
Okay. When they passed the tax, they included a series of sunsets. Parts of it would go away. The first part, which is about a little over half, goes away starting on January the 1st under current law. So the state will lose about $4 billion a year, give or take, out of an operating budget of $35 billion, I think, something like that. But that figure will ramp up further as the further sunset kicks in, and it's a lot of money. My colleague here is right that the people who are most likely to take it in a year, if something doesn't happen, are the social service providers, because education, everybody loves education, everybody loves school kids, it poll tests very well, so that's not on the cut list. And there's other things you can't cut a lot of medical spending because it's controlled by federal regulations. We just talked about pensions, you can't cut it anymore. So guess who takes in the air? The social services providers are the first ones who tend to get whacked. It's not very pretty. Now, the other thing I should say is that one of the things that's under debate and an issue in this election is two different philosophies really between how to get the state of Illinois out of this problem. Mr. Quinn's position is essentially that, hey, we had some problems, but we're getting our way out of it. Trust me, stick the course. Mr. Rau's position is, who are you kidding? The only way out of this is to grow our way out. We can't grow our way out under this current anti-business climate where the taxes are too high and the regulations are too high. We've got to cut those so that we can get people to move here or create new businesses that will hire people who will pay taxes, and that's how we'll get out of the problem. Which one of those is right? That's up to you guys to decide, but that's really what's on the ballot.
Come in from another angle. There is that was well said, by the way, because I think you take it in the year and even worse, you really bleed out if the cuts are into the human services, social services, whatever word you want to use to describe it. One of the levers and one of the attention getters, because it's so apparent and so true, is that if you don't take, all of us know healthcare, we're supposed to do early detection and prevention to prevent a smaller problem from getting bigger, correct? Then we have to take care of ourselves and our children so the problem doesn't grow. If you cut deeply into children's programs in early childhood, one of the longest studies that's ever been done on early childhood shows that for every dollar you invest in early childhood, you get $7 to $10 back. It's a scientific study, meaning it can be proven. And when you do the kind of work those of us who are in the not-for-profit sector do, sometimes return on investment's a phrase you hear. If I'm going to donate, I want a philanthropic return on my investment, so prove to me through outcome measures whether or not this is efficacious or not. I think the case could be made, and I would defer to my colleagues on this panel, is to say if I'm wrong, that anytime you invest in children or you invest in taking care of the most vulnerable in our society, you create greater problems from happening. There's a huge prison population in this country and in this state, and when people rotate out of those incarceration, they don't just come home. They look for jobs and they look to be mainstreamed in job programs and training, and reintegrating into our society takes place day in and day out, and that's the kind of work those of us do in human services, is work with populations like that, and the leading to crime or disintegration in neighborhoods. That kind of alarmist language isn't alarmist, it's telling the truth, and to being sure-footed about saying, I'm an advocate for what Mother Teresa called the poorest of the poor. Let me give you a couple statistics. What's that mean? 81% of the individuals and families that are taken care of through the agency I work for have household income of $20,000 a year or less. That's gross income. Everybody in the house working before taxes, $20,000 a year or less. That's as fragile as you can get. And there is no tomorrow, and there's no rainy day fund. So in this debate, when we talk with our public officials, there has to be a stand-up and a shout-out about taking care when the cuts are going to come. There's no way. I got a C in algebra. That's as far as I got. But I know how to add and subtract, and I can't find the answer to the solutions that have been put on the table. There are going to be cuts. There's hard choices. And I'm intentionally making the same point to you. I said earlier I wanted to partner with you and rile you up in some fashion. It's not working. The candy didn't work. I don't know what I'm going to do next. But to say this can't be just an experts and a legislator's debate, and then we're all going to go home and life is going to go on. That's not what's going to happen. There's going to be horrible outcomes if we don't speak up, and we being those of us who are in this room and our colleagues, and especially the boards and organizations. And I want to end on that. There's a real reluctance for not-for-profits who are very, very polite to ask their boards to take positions on taxes, or ask their boards to take positions because they think it's lobbying when in fact it's advocacy. And there is a big difference, is to make the case there are choices, there are values, and there are poor, and there are underserved people and children and minors that need to be taken care of. That has to be more of the debate. I've been trying to catch some of the debates, and it doesn't get a lot of play. It's on the business side of the ledger.
Well, I can't speak to the social service side of this as much as Dennis can, but I will just say that one of the effects that we're seeing as services are getting cut from a municipality standpoint is they're trying to increase revenues, and what we're seeing is they are adding more user fees. So what that means is, say you get into a car accident and the police or fire respond to the scene of the accident, you may get charged for their response. So that's just one of the ways the municipalities are responding in terms of cutting services, or trying to avoid cutting services. They're going to be adding more and more of these user fees. At least that's the trend that.
So in talking about taxes at the state level, we mentioned that they have this temporary rise, but it should also be noted that, one, and I wrote this down because I was very shocked by this. The state of Illinois has 26 different taxes that it executes every year. 26 different taxes. So not just income tax, sales tax, corporate tax, but a wide variety of other taxes. There is 1,504 fees that the city also uses to collect revenue, and this number has been growing fast over the last 15 years, right? So we're seeing more and more and more fees being added. So even when they can increase taxes, they're increasing the use of these fees. And so we're going to pay for this one way or the other, especially because right now in the state of Illinois, the number, all 26 of those taxes make up for 10%. I'm saying this right, 10% of the state's GDP. So all the money that comes in, right, 10% of that is paid in the form of a state tax. That's a lot. So when you hear Bruce Rauner complaining about the corporate tax rate, it is high. It's much higher than most of the other states in the United States, the corporate tax as well as the income tax. But there really is no, again, there's no obvious source of revenue. But if we increase these taxes, or if we make them more permanent, that means we're going to be asking Illinois residents to pay more in the form of state income taxes. But if they live in Chicago, we're going to be expecting them to pay more in terms of property taxes, as well as all the other fees that the state of Chicago, or the city, it might as well be the state. The city of Chicago is also increasing as well. And there are a lot of other suburbs that are also increasing their property taxes and increasing their sales taxes and things of this nature. So taxes across the state are going up at all different levels. Right now, the state income tax is a flat rate tax. That means everybody pays the same percentage of their income to the state, with some exemptions being made for individuals who make below a certain number. It might be 20,000, I can't remember to be exact. But right, the argument that many others are putting forth is that Illinois should move to a more progressive income tax. Not a lot of states have progressive income taxes. The federal income tax system is progressive, right? Depending on how much you pay a higher income, et cetera, et cetera. What this would do for Illinois, believe it or not, is it would, one, decrease the number of people who are exempt from paying the state income tax, which also means that poorer families would be expected to pay income taxes, although a small amount. But it could possibly bring the state an extra, I think, $6 to $8 billion to move to a more progressive tax. But the people who are fighting against this, obviously, are those with higher incomes, because they will have to pay a larger percentage of their income. And it will be much larger than the 5% that they pay now. 5% doesn't seem like that much when you're facing a $100 billion debt on top of the other forms of debt that we're also facing.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple questions from the audience and then go back to the panel.
The states that have the progressive tax, which are they, and is it working there?
The question is on the states that have progressive taxes. Does anybody know which ones are working?
It's like asking how cold is it out when it's cold. You can't answer that question. Most states that have an income tax have a progressive income tax. I happen to basically favor a progressive income tax, but there is no question, and the academics will disagree vehemently over this, there's no question that when you raise a tax on only a portion of your population, it tends to make that population move. And there are problems with it. In California, for instance, California has a very progressive income tax. But when the stock market goes belly up and there's not a lot of capital gains for rich people to report, guess what? They have huge problems. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, they were really down in the dumps because they relied too heavily on just a progressive income tax. You know, I work for business publications, so I talk to rich guys all the time, and you know, and they chuckle about it. So, yeah, you go ahead and raise the taxes and watch me change my tax domicile to somewhere out of state in about 5 seconds. It sounds tempting, and I think to some degree we ought to try it, but there's a guy named Flaubert. He was a Frenchman. He was Louis XIV's finance minister, Louis XIV, Marie Antoinette's husband. And as he put it, and nothing has changed, the art of taxation is to pluck the goose that squawketh the least. Nothing has changed.
Next question.
Yes, I keep hearing groups that are looking at government and are supposed to keep them honest, but nothing ever really happens. And why is it that sometimes we learn what government's up to by these awful ads that are running when we have a book coming out? I didn't know that Judy Hart-Topinka was taking a $500,000 salary plus a pension for something. Why don't we hear about all the nonsense that's going on? I mean, how can our legislators borrow from this and steal from that and then nobody knows but a few friends who are keeping a secret because they're doing it too?
Let's go to Katie first with BGA and then to Twyla.
Well, that is a good question. I wish I had a full answer for you, other than, I mean, this is kind of what we are trying to do, is it expose these problems and make people aware. Unfortunately, not everybody seems to care, I guess, and a lot of times they can get away with doing these things, and it sort of goes back to the initial problem I was saying that government needs to be held accountable. So, you know, it's not only exposing the problems, but then once the problems are exposed, what are you going to do about it? So, I mean, that's what we push for, and I'm not sure I have a full answer for you then. I don't know what the solution is other than to just try to stay involved and you know, participate as much as you can.
But we're not, as citizens, normal citizens, we're not in a position to know what's going on. I mean, aren't there people who have enough power that they can get together and watch everything?
Twyla, do you have an answer?
That's paradise, I guess.
So there are many states like Massachusetts, especially on the East Coast, where the state legislatures have created various bipartisan commissions whose sole purpose is to bring transparency and investigate different things that the government is doing, etc. But in order to do that in Illinois, you would have to have your politicians vote to create these commissions in these departments. And on the one hand, that's more money to spend, but it's also how many politicians are going to vote for a boss? Right? How many politicians are going to vote to support to create this bipartisan commission, especially when that bipartisan commission is going to make their job a lot harder? The second point is the media. And the stories that they do get caught up on, and the stories that you and I see, the headlines are the same. You pick up whatever 4 papers are being published, the big ones, and even some of the small ones, the headlines are very similar. The topics are very similar. It's the same story written differently by somebody else with a different perspective. And so the other stories are, I don't know, in somebody's folder or email maybe. I can't find them either, and I read a ton. I get every tweet from the APs, from the Sun-Times, from the Times, wherever. I read everybody's Facebook page and all that, and it's still the same stories over and over again. So part of it is that you have to have government actually take the time to create these institutions, which they're not going to do because it's not in their best interest as individual politicians. And then you also have to have the media being able to, and I won't be so hard on the media because they have bosses too. Right, and there's whole classes about the politics of media. Okay, but yes, we should be seeing a lot more of these stories and a lot more of this information. It shouldn't only come out when there's an attack act.
Well, since we mentioned Mary Antoinette, maybe maybe if we can solve it by anyone caught with his or her hand in the pot.
Well, let me respond to that in a little different way. If you ask the typical politician about, does the media do too many nasty stories about what I'm up to? The verdict is going to be unanimous. All our friends at the VGA do for the most part. And they have all kinds of outlets. I've worked with them. Channel 5 has worked with them. Sometimes has something in the paper almost every month, almost every week. All they do is go do investigations of what politicians are up to. And if they find something that we ought to know about, they put it out and we read about it. It happens all the time. Now, in the case of Judy Barr Topinka, this is a good example of one of the institutional problems of the pension system. We talked before about how government hasn't put in what they should have put in, and I could kind of sense it collective. Well, that's not right. The poor old folks ought to get what they were promised. But the pension system is based on longevity. The longer you're in the pension system, the more you get. Judy Barr Topinka has been in public office. She got elected. I mean, nobody hornswoggled anybody. She's been in office for like 40 years.
Yes,
and under the rules...
She's been double dipping.
Yeah, you could call it double dipping, but under the rules of the pension system, once you've retired and you draw your pension, if you want to go back to work and take a different job, you're entitled to also collect your salary. You may not think that's right, but look at it how it works in the private sector. A lot of schools, for example, where professors retire, they draw their pension, and then there's a vacancy. Hey, we need somebody to teach. They come back and they teach for a quarter or two or whatever. Should they work for free? Depends on your perspective.
They don't work for that kind.
Right up here.
Green?
Hi,
Is
yeah.
it green? Is it green? They work for something. They work for something.
So it seems to be a given in all the conversations that we are taxed too darn high. And so I'm questioning that, because if you set aside all these fees that we scrambled to pass in order to pay for basic services, if you set aside the sales tax, isn't Illinois, with its flat tax, which is horribly regressive and puts the burden on working people, isn't Illinois one of the lowest taxed states around?
No. If you look at the combined, I mean, you can't really separate it out tax by tax. You have to look at what the because in some states this tax is high and this tax is low. In another state, this one might be high, this one might be low. You have to look at what we pay in all the taxes kind of combined. If you look at the total tax load in Illinois, we're a little bit above the median. We're probably 31st or 32nd, depending on the methodology of the study. We're a little higher than we were, but we're not as high as say, they are on the coast.
We're 32nd?
By some studies, yes.
And
But
highest or
that's
lowest?
the overall tax load. That's all the taxes combined.
Oh, so you don't want to look at the income tax?
The income tax might be low, might be low, but then another tax is high. We have in this state particularly high property taxes, and we have particularly high sales taxes relative to other jurisdictions.
In the back. Oops, sorry. In the back.
I do want to make it clear, though, that there are some states that have no income tax. So as Greg said, right, there are some states that don't have income tax. Texas and Florida don't have income taxes. They make up for a lot of it in terms of their tourism tax. There are a lot of other states that are able to keep their corporate taxes low because they have other very major revenue sources like natural resources and things like that. So if you go up to the north, west, they don't have as high of taxes either because they're able to sell a lot of their natural resources, etc. Illinois hasn't taken as much advantage of the natural resources that they have, which is really only water. But it's becoming more and more of an idea to start looking at Illinois as a source for water as the Southwest is enduring their massive drought. But then the question is how to get there.
In the back.
Yes, this question is from Katie Greaves from the Better Government Association. First of all, my hat's off to your organization. Throughout the years I've been a resident of Illinois, you try very hard to bring light on some subjects. Very early in the conversation, you used a word that I think should be banned, and that's called transparency, because I don't know what that means anymore. I think we hear it at election time, and every politician will often use it. In your work, can you point to an organization that has been able to always complete their transparency? In other words, that if I open their books, it's going to be good, that particular organization and government? Because everybody says they're for transparency, and then we take this little step and, oh, we're transparent, and then I don't
Okay,
know what
let's,
happens.
Katie, do you have an answer for that?
Sure, yeah. So I guess I'm on the opposite end of things here in terms of where I'm at the BGA, because I'm looking at the agencies that have all the problems with transparency. So in terms of a group that stands out, there isn't necessarily one that comes to mind. I would say everybody could improve. And it comes in a lot of forms too. You know, it's access to documents online, but it's also how they handle Freedom of Information Act requests. A lot of times we struggle with getting public records from agencies because they will deny or they will ignore requests. So that's one area we've been fighting a lot more lately. We actually brought on an attorney who's taking on some cases for us when these agencies don't comply. There's also the Open Meetings Act. I mean, that's just another avenue where we've seen agencies totally disregard the law. I was at a meeting less than 2 weeks ago where a board member came up to me and told me I wasn't allowed to record the meeting, which is not true. I mean, you can any member of the public can record at public meetings. So in other words, we see this just in so many different ways, not just in terms of databases online, but at meetings. It's just a pervasive problem. I wish I could tell you who's doing a good job.
Before, I know we're going to lose Greg pretty soon, so I want to get in a question about referendums that are coming up on the ballot. If any of the panelists have any ones that they're particularly watching or want to talk about.
I guess I get stuck with this one. No. In Illinois, well, I'm going to contradict myself here. But the first thing I want to say is that much of what occurs in American society now, this increasing mistrust of government, all the negative TV ads, is part of an ideological argument by one of the major political parties, which essentially feels that government is bad, all government does is hurt people, and that we need to get rid of as much government as we can. I would disagree with that because government in this country is a leveler. It accomplishes things in terms of helping people who don't have by taking some away from those who have a lot. That no other institution can really do. It can be overdone, but so can hatred of government as an ideological weapon. One. Two, that having been said, this referendum business in Illinois is usually a pretty good racket. Referendums are usually put on the ballot in Illinois by the legislature for two reasons and two reasons only. Reason one is because they think it will help them with the ballot box. In this case, it's a referendum about the minimum wage. It was put on in hopes of attracting more votes from people who favor the minimum wage, who oftentimes don't vote in off-year elections. So it'll turn out whether they're the vote for Democratic candidates. The other reason the legislature puts on referendums generally is to keep off the ballot something else that somebody else wants to put on the ballot that they don't want to vote on. It's a little bit of a game. Usually, they're not worth reading.
Yeah, the minimum wage is really interesting because it is something that the legislator should have done, right? I don't know if we needed to wait for a referendum. It could have been taken to a vote, and they could have passed it because we need to raise, you know, the quality of life here in Illinois. But as Crain pointed out, it seems to be much more politically advantageous to send it to referendum and let us decide. But by letting us decide, again, it is going to be the people who generally support raising the minimum wage or are heavily opposed of the minimum wage. And what that essentially does is bring, the hope is to increase turnout, but also take the pressure off of our leaders to make the decision themselves, which is kind of sad, right? I don't know if it's, let's raise the minimum wage.
Nick, do you have a question?
I have two, may I?
Sure.
I was recently in Nashville, Tennessee, and I was in a conversation with some people. We were discussing politics, and I said, well, we have a, I'm sorry.
I was recently in Nashville, Tennessee, and I was talking about politics with some people who live there. And I was discussing our problems, which you have all been discussing. And they said to me, well, we have a balanced budget here. And I said, well, so do we. And so it relates to this question of transparency and understanding. And so it's a way of a comment, but there are two questions. If we don't vote for the person, if we vote for policy, we're not policy wonks. It's very, very hard. As you have shown, it's very hard for the best of people with the best of information to understand the whole system because we are in a mess and it's hard to unravel it and understand what to do. Okay, so if we don't vote by personality and we don't understand enough to vote for the best policy, then some people feel that they're not going to vote. They're not going to choose between Ron and Quinn. I'm not saying that's the right position. I'm just saying that some people feel that. The second thing is that what does balanced budget mean here in Illinois? So, and I did talk to several accountants in Illinois, and they told me it was perfectly legal what Judy Bartvinka has said about this issue, and she's not in favor of this problem, this situation. She puts it right on her website that if you don't list the debt and you don't pay anything on the debt, it doesn't appear in the budget, and therefore you have a balanced budget. People in Nashville said, well, that's just crooks from Chicago.
Can I also say that what else they're doing too is borrowing to pay that debt, right? And that's something that's like personal finance 101. You never borrow to pay your light bill, right? Because next month you still have to pay the light bill, but now you also have to pay the debt you incurred.
Well, why doesn't that show up? See, how can you have a balanced budget if you borrowed? Why isn't that there?
Well, because if you're borrowing it, then you don't have to pay back that money that you borrowed for a while, so it won't be on the budget this year.
That I don't understand.
It shows itself as a form of revenue, and it becomes an expenditure when you start paying it back.
Did you understand that, Diane?
It's crazy.
All right, let me take a stab at it. When you borrow money, like a mortgage for your house, you agree to enter into a payment plan. But the only thing that shows up on your budget for this year is the amount you're going to have to pay toward that borrowing this year. The other 29 years or whatever don't show up until those years roll around. You're still on the hook for it, but it doesn't come out of your current income.
But Twyla said that the revenue that you get, the money you got, shows up as income.
Well, yes, it does, because it's usually spent right away. When government borrows money, what you're supposed to, what the good book of proper accounting says is that when a government borrows money, it should be for long-term projects, and the money should be paid off as long as the asset is good. So if you're going to borrow money to build a building for 30 years, the building ought to last for 30 years. Or if you're going to buy a new fire truck, the note ought to be due for as long as you're getting use out of the fire truck. Well, it's really, money is always fungible. Anything that's green is fungible. What government will often do is, in effect, borrow money to pay for operating expenses. Or what Rahm Emanuel has been pretty good at, and Rich Daley was even better at it, is there'll be a note that's coming due for something that was spent 15 years ago, but instead of paying the principal, they'll just go out and re-borrow the same money and push the principal and the interest down the road another 15 or 20 years. it does show up in the financials, but it just doesn't show up as what I have to take out of my pocket this year, because you don't take it out this year. Your grandkid takes it out of your pocket in 15 years.
I want to talk a little bit about an area Twyla's working on, which is TIFs. We'll rotate back to, well, it's a state issue as well across the state of Illinois, but in particular Chicagoans have been talking a lot about TIFs lately. Can you explain what they are and what your work is?
So TIFs are a very interesting tool used primarily by local governments for economic development practices. Textbook says that it's almost the only economic development tool that cities really have at their disposal. What a city will actually do is they will designate an area as a TIF, and from that moment on, the city will only collect a certain amount of taxes, the same amount of taxes for the duration of that TIF. So let's just say that before they designated this area as a TIF, the city collected $1,000 in total taxes, property taxes from this TIF. Right, so now we've designated that. What we've essentially done is frozen the amount of money that the city takes in the form of taxes from that district. If there's anything extra, because of hopefully it has grown in the last year or 23 years, right, then that district gets to keep all of the other taxes. So in year 1, Chicago collects $1,000 in taxes from the TIF. In year 2, they'll collect $1,000 in taxes. But as this district's economy begins to grow and property valuations begin to increase, the amount of property tax revenues will also increase, and this district gets to keep that. So if in year 2, there's $3,000 worth of taxes in that area, the city of Chicago gets the $1,000, and the district gets to keep the $2,000, and so on and so forth. It makes a lot of sense, except it's become quite clear that Chicago, and even the state of Illinois, more broadly speaking, has overused TIFs. There are some people in the city that will argue that we should just get rid of TIFs entirely. I am not one of those people. I do think, though, that we have to pay a little bit more attention to how we use TIFs, because what has essentially happened is that you have very high-performing TIFs, and they're able to keep a big chunk of the taxes that are paid in that community and not send them to Chicago's general fund. And what that means then is that the city of Chicago is missing out on a very large amount of revenue, right? A very large amount. And I'm not talking about like the west side of Chicago or North Lawndale. These are TIFs also, but they are very broke TIFs, right? They are not growing at all. What I'm talking about are the TIFs that are kind of like North and Clybourne, or the near west side, or the south loop that we've talked about, or the loop in general, et cetera, right? Those 4 or 5 TIFs all by themselves are able to take home like $50 million every year. That's $50 million that's going back into overperforming economies and not going into Chicago's budget. There are other TIFs in other suburbs that are also been highlighted as being problematic, right? But what that essentially means then is that there is a source of revenue, a very big one, that the city and the state probably could tap into a little bit better if we just kind of rethought who we let become TIFs. Right, and that's the thing. And Crain and I were talking about this.
Yeah, TIFs are a big issue. Let me try to explain it a little bit differently. Let's say I'm the mayor, you in the black shirt. You're going to build a factory, and you come to me and say, I want to build a factory, we're going to hire people, and we're going to put it on the near west side. But I tell you what, the guys in Indiana, they offered me a big tax break if I'll put it in Indiana. What are you going to give me, Mayor Hinz, to put my factory in your town? So I need to come up with some incentive money, as it's called. It's a real common thing. It happens all over the country for good or bad. States offer incentives to lure business. They give back money. Texas, you know, the big bastion of low taxes, offers zillions of dollars in incentives. Because the argument is that, well, the companies will come here and they'll create a great job and wealth. Even if we give them something back, we'll still have more than we would have had without it. So they create this TIF district, and it's a way to raise money to incent development that wouldn't have occurred otherwise, but for the incentive. The problem comes in proving the but for. Because once you have this little special boodle of dough, it can be real easy to abuse it. You give it to your friends and your buddies and connected people, whatever, and you're not really getting development, maybe. It wouldn't have come in otherwise. So there's this big debate about whether the system, not so much about whether it's been abused, it has been, but whether it's abused most of the time or just some of the time. I would argue that there's a place for TIFs, because as the professor said, it is about the only incentive tool the city now has to lure in a business that potentially could really create a lot of wealth and hire a lot of people who wouldn't have a job otherwise. But it's too easy for it to get kind of political, particularly in Chicago. I gotta go, but thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from the, go ahead.
While Greg makes his exit, I just want to point out, while I mentioned that we increased the corporate tax to 9.3%, I have noted here that the corporate tax in the state of Illinois is the 4th highest in the United States. And that's kind of shocking, right? Except only a third of the corporations pay it.
Right.
Yeah, I love that face behind you on the side, I'm sorry. Only a third of businesses pay this corporation tax.
So why can't we make them pay?
Well, that's how we get back to this topic of incentives, right? As I mentioned before, just last year, the city of Chicago gave away, I can't remember the number now, I want to say it was like 50 million or so in tax expenditures. Those are those various credits, deductions, and exemptions. So when we give away these incentives to these major corporations because we're so scared they won't locate here, what we're doing is we're giving them a big chunk of our tax base. And then you and I, who don't get these exemptions, right, as we start planning for the 2013 tax season, 2014, whatever it is.
Well, let me go back real quick to what part of Nick's question was, how people vote, how they vote, and how you suggest they vote. Meaning, is it about personality and someone that you think is ethical or not, or is it dig down on these issues? We're coming up less than 2 weeks away from an election, and how do you suggest people make those decisions?
Repeat that question one more time.
Well, Nick was asking, like, how do we come to the decision? Some people will vote when they vote against somebody. They're going to the polls, they're going to vote against somebody. How do you make a decision to vote for somebody? And I'm just curious how you make your own decisions about candidates if you don't have time to dig down in every single thing we were talking about today about a candidate's positions.
Well, if I may, to stay anchored in the decision-making based on values, on ethics and values, one of the things to think about if you're thinking about the poor, the very poor, and the newly poor. These are the people that foreclosed, lost their jobs, those who don't have. On the minimum wage, I know people, I've met them personally, who will walk 8 miles for an appointment in an agency, get free services because they can't afford the bus fare, or they weren't able to figure out how to get free fares and how to use the system for their advantage, because the system doesn't mean anything to them unless it's explained. So there's literally a gap between what we think is available and that. And so if you say to people who are working 2 jobs or working in households where there's multiple jobs, if you add up that, for us, small amount of money, when I believe I got the statistic right, what's on the ballot, will be on the ballot is going from $8.25 to $10 an hour. That's a huge increase in a household that has very little money. I think that's one of the decisions to make. The second decision is both candidates, or the major candidates, because there is a libertarian candidate, but 2 of the major candidates, one of them is saying, basically signaling, neither of them are saying do away with, and right now, the temporary income tax. Mr. Honor is saying phase it out, and there's a strong suggestion from our governor to keep it, right? And there's a decision point there, is how do you address structural problems? Structural problem means long-term. It's not tomorrow. And so if one of the ways that you are able to fund those in need is through the available money that would be available by keeping the income tax, then you might consider voting and urging that people vote for it, knowing it stinks. And we got here because of rascalism, and we got here because of structural problems that have built up, but let's care for those who need to be taken care of. So I think those are decision point, and its values, and it's thinking of others than ourselves and our anger and our tax when we make that decision.
I think at this point, especially close to the election, as things are getting very heated, it's easy to kind of get tired of all the attack ads and everything you've been hearing. But personally, I just think that, especially at this day and age, it's very easy to get caught up and educated. You can very easily go online and find out, if you don't know yet, who these people are all about, where they stand on on the issues that matter to you. And so personally, I just think the best thing you could possibly do is go online and educate yourself as much as you can. That's just my take.
I always tell my students, right, to think about the future, right? Because a lot of the issues that are being talked about right now, they sound very short-sighted. They sound like they're very right now problems. But the truth of the matter is that they have long-term implications, very, very long-term implications. Especially when we start talking about these savage cuts, that's the line that Quinn keeps using about what Bruce Rauner is going to do. What exactly are you going to cut? Because if you cut education, now we're dealing with a problem, a big problem. We're addressing K through 12 education. We're also trying to address the cost of higher education at the same time. We also have to deal with, again, like I said, infrastructure. Who's going to be here? Who's actually going to create a plan so that we can actually start fixing the Illinois' infrastructure, the tollway and the railroad, so that we can remain this huge economic hub. We want to be able to improve schools so that it's no secret that Illinois schools are not doing as great as other schools in other states, right? And that has long-term implications. It has a huge impact on the quality of our workforce. If we're attempting to attract more businesses, but yet we're cutting how much we're spending on education, we're decreasing how much we're providing for higher education, then you're almost automatically decreasing the quality of your workforce at the same time. So when you're also asking about the minimum wage, right? I don't know. For me, it's just all empathy. And it's long-term planning. You got to have good schools. I myself have a 7-year-old. I would love for her to be able to go forth and have a great education and grow and prosper. But I understand the privilege that she has by having 2 parents who are both academics. I feel bad for her in that sense. But I do truly understand the privilege that she has, right? I'm able to send her to school in Oak Park. There's no worries about what college or university she wants to go to. We'll make it work. But there are a lot of other families that are not. And on a minimum wage, how is it that you're going to be able to afford a good school for your parents, right? I know a ton of parents who are trying to send their kids to school and they've taken on an extra job working at DSW or wherever else, right? So they're doing a 9 to 5 and it's not minimum wage, but it's not considered to be middle income either. And then they're taking on another job and their kid is taking on a job too so that they can pay for college tuition, right? The minimum wage as it stands right now is not enough for anybody. People who are working full-time with a minimum wage are still collecting benefits.
One of the things I would suggest too for the elections, Windy City Times, we don't endorse any candidates, but we do list the endorsements of a wide range of organizations, including all the bar associations. There are other places that list these too. So I would, find the organizations that do endorsements, like the National Organization for Women, other groups that you might agree with or not, and they have done the homework. So it's different than what the BGA might do in terms of vetting corruption. These are people that vet them, especially as you go down the ballot and you get frustrated that you have no idea what these judges are like. You can look at the association. So in our current issue, Windy City Times, you can get all of the, I think about 15 different bar association rankings of all the judges. So you can go across the column and see which ones, the women's bar, et cetera. And other, there's definitely a lot of resources for you to, and you can take those sample ballots into the voting booth.
Yeah, make
so
a cheat sheet.
Make a cheat sheet ahead of time. You don't want to be the one that doesn't finish the ballot. With the referendums, there's a couple that are binding, and there's definitely a lot of judicial races that we should care about as well.
Maybe you could remind people, there's a site, I believe, that you can go to, that you can actually download the ballot and then fill
Well,
it
if
out.
you're in Cook County, the Cook County, David Orr's office, the Cook County clerk, you can get sample ballots through there. Don't just take the party sample ballots, right? Those are only the party approved
I'm
candidates.
talking about that when
Yeah.
you do make your decisions, but then you can quickly.
Yeah, so go to either, if you're in the city of Chicago, it's different than if you're outside of the city of Chicago and still in Cook County. So make sure you're downloading which is correct for you and your county on the election board. So yeah, so that way you can know it ahead of time.
And I also put in a strong recommendation for what you recommended with the Windy City Times. I've used it often.
Yeah, because even though we're
The way it's laid out, you can make a lot of decisions that
Yeah,
way.
even though we're an LGBT paper, we list the endorsements of a wide range of organizations, all in one simple chart for all the races.
Yeah, just an issue that's always been kind of coming up, especially with this looming deficit that we have to pay. you know, there's going to be some points when we start to have to really look at, okay, what are we going to be able to raise to cover this fund? And the big thing is, you know, with property tax, since that's one of the largest ways that we collect money in the city, you know, urban environments are known for affordable housing. That's what makes it urban. You know, so with this debt, could it remain that affordable housing actually is what is called as affordable housing, or are we going to have to start tapping into that money and really increasing rates to where it's no longer that cheap?
I think in certain areas it's already happened, but definitely love to hear how our panelists feel about that.
So, and this is happening across the nation, as cities are scrounging to come up with more revenue, what they are doing, they don't want to raise property taxes, right? But there's another way to increase your property tax base, right? You make everybody reevaluate the value of their properties. So what is being happening across the nation and throughout the state as well is that there are many families who, even after making just minor renovations, are being forced to have their property reassessed, and they're being reassessed at much higher rates. As someone who is looking to buy a home in the next year, I'm looking at something, and granted I'm in Oak Park, okay, so it's already crazy, but some of these houses, they're asking, and I'm like, where did you get this number from? Right, this is 2014, it's not 2005, okay? I don't know where you've been in the last 12 years, but, I mean, I get it, your house was worth $375 in 2005, but it's 2014, and I'm probably only willing to give you $211. But the village has assessed their property at that value. And it's because the village can get a larger amount of taxes on a $374 mortgage than $211,000 mortgage. And that's not right, especially not right for home buyers like myself. Because right now it's a renter's market for that reason. Right, houses are being over-evaluated and the taxes on them are really, really high. And people, if I don't have to pay the mortgage and property taxes, I won't.
Do you guys have anything to say on that issue?
I'm going to go back to, I don't know your name, of course, but the lady in the back row who's raised the issue of transparency. A gentleman who I worked with up here about 20 years ago had a wonderful phrase, and he said, I would like meaningful transparency. And I think that there is a way to come up with definitions so people at least know what we're talking about. And I think whether it's tax or whether or not it is the progressive tax, that there has to be, again, a demand that, not dumbing it down, but talk common sense. You know how it is with some people, they have a huge reservoir of common sense and you always know what they're saying. And then there's others and your eyes glaze over and you think about anything that's being said except what they're saying because they're making no sense. I think calling it out what it actually is something to go back to, which is common sense, so that at least I know what the debate's about. So when complex questions are asked, call it what it is. This is too complex for me. Let's just define it for me. And that's the way we're going to find our way out of structural problems, is to define what happened along the way where we lost our common sense and we allowed creative financing and budgeting where we have a balanced budget when it's anything but. It's a Orwellian way of discussing issues that we've allowed. We have really allowed that, where we defer to elected officials and experts to speak for us when in fact it's gibberish. So I would say I take it one by one, and I don't know how else to do it. I can't just swallow it whole and say I've got an answer or take on it. It's like, okay, let's talk about the biggest bubble that's not bubble, I was in medicine for a long time in healthcare, so you'd say, do you land something or do you bring it down slowly with everything? There is no quick cure for it. It's figure out which ones are the worst that have to be dealt with, meaningful transparency so we all know what we're talking about, and then meaningful accountability is we're going to hold you to these rules. I don't think there's a shortcut. Yes, sir.
You had mentioned early on about our part in this. I was going to comment more. I try to send emails and things to my representatives, although my representatives happen to support. But I understand the need for them to have my input, so they have that as a base for saying my constituents support my approach. But do you have any ideas about how to either word, verbalize, or deal to do this kind of thing?
Yes, and I'll actually do it offline with you, because there's a short answer to it and there's a longer one. One of the things that political offices do, and they all do, whether it's aldermanic or state senator or state rep, is they do a tally on who emails and writes. They keep a tab, and it's not because they're going to fine you and do something. They actually want to know what the issue was that the person was knocking on the door. And it's numbers. I think we have to turn left and right and our neighbors and our own family members and get them involved. Again, it's not a short issue. Specificity helps. If you call, and I did call one of my elected officials when I said, okay, we're having a panel, we're talking, what's your take on, you know, some of the issues that were talked about today. I was asked an issue before I hung up, and it was this. I was asked this question. Okay, I want to ask you something. Do you, taxpayer who lives in, you know, a couple of miles from here, are you willing to accept a continuation of the tax? In other words, you're a taxpayer, so you can't. It's both ways.
Yeah.
An elected official wants, so it's a dialogue, and I would say to you, that's the way it starts, and say, well, how many people are willing to, and under what conditions? It's a negotiation. What most people do is they treat legislatures, or a lot of them do at least, like celebrities instead of public servants, and they're using our money, so it's a process of changing. So I would say talk to them, she or he, the same way you talk to your children, your spouse, your loved ones, and anyone else. That's a big beginning, and I hope I am not saying this in a way where it sounds at all too simplistic. That's fundamental to having a dialogue start, is slow them down and say, you're using jargon, I don't get it. So explain this to me more clearly, and what they'll tell you privately, they don't understand it either.
So I think, you know, just to give time for people to maybe socialize afterwards and ask questions, let's take one or two more questions. There was one back here.
Thanks so much for all of your input so far. And I've heard some nuances about comprehensive tax reform, based on more than a progressive income tax, but certainly having that be part of one of the pillars of comprehensive tax reform. What other areas would you see in that package of comprehensive tax reform other than a progressive income tax?
The tax code is insanely difficult to understand. It's been argued by scholars that the majority, and by majority, the vast majority of state legislators have no clue what the tax code is and how it is written. They themselves don't understand it. It's that convoluted. And it's not that easy. I know when I file my taxes, I know how much my check has to be, right? But then how they got to that number, it's very hard to figure out, even if you print the tax code out. So what a lot of people have been arguing for in terms of comprehensive tax reform in Illinois is simply just to make the tax code clearer, right? And that would add to this notion of transparency, right? And also this consolidation of these different and often overlapping departments and programs and fees, et cetera, et cetera.
But that would really look at the cost side rather than the income side. The duplicative services, certainly, between state, county, and city units, has a multiplication of duplicitous service and duplicitous people providing the services.
But I think what you're talking about is if you reform it and simplify, you're also getting rid of a lot of the things that people get to write off and all those, you know, you're actually getting more revenue.
You're going to save more money, and then you also are going to make it harder for people to get away with the different exemptions, deductions, and credits that they are getting away with now. It will force us to revisit every aspect of the tax code.
Isn't this part of what you were talking about when you say the corporations are only paying a third of the corporations?
And a part of it is because of the exemptions that are built into the tax code, and it's also because of the incentives that they're getting to locate here, right? And I just want to make sure I tell everybody in my urban politics class, studies have shown repeatedly that incentive packages are not the 1 through the 4th most important business locational decision factor, right? They're considering infrastructure, economies of scale. Are there other companies that are doing the same thing I'm doing? Are my suppliers located here? Is it cheaper to manufacture here or cheaper to ship from here? Right? Talent of workforce, the quality of life, right? The tax incentive is just like icing on the cake. Companies know, they probably come up with maybe 3 or 4 different cities that they would love to locate in, and then it's like, okay, let's see which one will give us the most money.
Okay, final question, back row.
Okay, comprehensive tax reform, and simplifying the tax code, all the same meaning?
Yes and no.
That's what I'm talking about, as a voter.
Right.
You know, I would have been happy to leave today without hearing the word comprehensive tax reform, because I didn't know about it, I was totally in the dark, so now I've got this to worry.
It's just tax reform.
Simplifying the tax code is not automatically comprehensive tax reform.
Okay,
Comprehensive
thank
tax reform would be like reviewing the entire, from A to Z.
Thank you.
Any final questions from, input from the panel, and then we'll go, I think, allow folks some time to socialize and ask questions directly. Great. Okay, well, I'm gonna let you have the last word. You get the last word. You get the last
Is
word.
there any chance of, at any point, getting a lot of these problems solved by government coming together, rewriting a tax code, rewriting certain laws, rewriting a pension law, so that Judy Barr, you think you can get a $500,000 salary and a pension? That was not answered clearly, because the panelists used the example of a teacher. I'm not talking about a teacher. I'm talking about a woman who's getting a high salary. So why will we ever redo these?
She's not the only one, though. There are definitely your governmental officials who retire and they go to work for interest groups and they lobby. So now they're collecting a governmental pension, but then they're also lobbying governmental officials using networks that they
And they're
create.
also sharing secrets.
And I should
So-
say,
So quick answer, let's say yes or no to the lady's question. What, yes or no?
I don't see it happening anytime soon.
The question was, is there hope? I think
Yes.
The hope is with you. Make noise.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.